am going to go through this last kind of one third a little bit more rapid. I want to talk now about the parks and people concept. I'm going to go through it rapidly, partly because we've already covered it in previous conversations, and so we don't necessarily have to cover it to death, but it is a topic to think about. I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, I mentioned it the very first week of class, the idea of fortress conservation. It's a sort of pejorative term but for protected areas, specifically protected areas that rely on the idea of excluding human uses, right? Something like a national park. Admittedly, it's still being used for recreation, but not for like extraction of a natural resource, I guess, other than the tourism land. So fortress conservation, the idea of sort of putting a fence around it, whether it's a literal fence or a metaphorical fence, right? Legally speaking, excluding human uses to varying degrees, right? It might be something like a national forest where you can still do certain kinds of controlled logging, or it might be something like a wilderness area, which in the US is like one of our most protected areas. Like all you're doing in there is camping, probably. Um, and so that kind of a model has often been the way that protected areas have been approached, especially historically previous to the 1990s, but still in a lot of areas and in a lot of cases. And so that has given rise to what we call the parks and people debate or discussion. Parks here being sort of a shorthand for strongly protected areas. In the US, we tend to call those parks or wilderness areas. And some of the concerns that different scholars have brought up when they've actually gone into communities and done actual research with communities looking at the effects of protected areas is displacement, people having to leave their land, or even more often, being allowed to stay but with severe restrictions that make it hard to live there, disproportionality, the fact that that tends to be particularly a problem in the global south, and sort of all of that sort of related, as we've talked about before, to this philosophical problem, this idea that humans have to be separate from nature for it to be sustained, which is probably not going to be a sustainable model for the future when we're already using 50% of the land. We need to figure out a way to coexist, because I don't think we're going to be able to put enough land around fences. And so we have to think of other things. But the amount of protected area has increased rapidly, as you can see from this map. Another UN graph from UNEP. And bear in mind, it's all very different, right? This is strictly protected, like just camp kind of stuff. This is national park, so probably tourism, maybe even some hunting. A national monument. They're kind of using terms to standardize across many different governments, because obviously different governments will use different terms, but this is the basic. There's these like IUCN categories that kind of give the basic idea. And then protected, and then this blue is like, again, things like a BLM land or something where there's still a lot of resource extraction, but it's being managed, and then no category. They couldn't figure out what to call it. So as you can see, huge increases, and some of that increase has been in industrialized nations. For example, under the Obama administration, Utah saw a major expansion of a national monument called Bears Ears, as we've talked about. But at the same time, and under the Clinton administration, a huge expansion of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. At the same time, a lot of that growth has happened in the equatorial regions, which are also tend to be where we have a lot of our global biodiversity hotspots, which is what this map shows. Areas that are just, everywhere is important in terms of preserving biodiversity. Some places, though, just have a tremendous amount of species in one place, and some would argue that that's a good place to focus conservation efforts. And indeed, a lot of protected areas have sprung up in these areas, partly from the governments, partly from conservation NGOs buying up land and putting it as protected areas. So a lot of the protected areas, though, have happened in those areas. At the same time, where we're seeing these huge growths of protected lands, we are also dealing with, these are some of the places where we have some of the most poverty as well, right? So if you're restricting human uses of the environment, and again, ultimately all economies depend on an environment. So if you're restricting human use of an environment precisely where there's poverty, there's potentially conflict, right? And especially it tends to be less with urban populations and more with rural and indigenous populations. By the way, I'm not suggesting that all of the nations with global biodiversity have done a ton of protected areas. As you can see on this map, that's clearly not the case. And some places with very low biodiversity have done a ton of protected areas. So I wasn't trying to make a false equivalency there. But sometimes protected areas can have effects that are not anticipated, or maybe are anticipated but wouldn't be anticipated if you're not in the government, right? If you're just sort of an outsider and you hear about a new protected area to protect the wildlife and you say, yes, great, the rhinos need more protection, this is good. And it is good from that perspective of the rhinos potentially, but it can also sometimes have really deleterious effects on local people. Take, for example, the Central Kalahari Game Park. It's in Botswana. There's a article in The Guardian, which is more than 5 years old, as that nice little timer thing tells me. But anyways, they talk about some San people, some foraging people who anthropologists have written about a lot, who got beaten up and tied up and basically like yelled at for hunting within a game park, which is lands that traditionally they've been hunting for a really, really long time. And that's happened in many different parts of the territory of, San people. It becomes harder and harder and harder to live a foraging lifestyle as more and more areas either get put into private land or get put into these like privately managed game ranches where there's like safaris and stuff, or into these like conservation areas by the government. But it all sort of works out the same in the sense of you're not allowed to hunt there anymore. And indeed, many people from these communities are now turning to wage labor. So a very distinctive cultural way of life, one which has persisted for a very long time, is starting to die out, partly because of these restrictions. Not only, but partly. Tiger reserves in India, similar situation. We all want to preserve tigers. They're actually my favorite animal. Some of the tiger reserves, though, have involved actively displacing or severely restricting the land rights of indigenous people. Same thing with Maasai pastoralists in East Africa. So it's not just hunter-gatherer peoples, but also, for example, people that migrate large amounts of cattle herds across the landscape and are now being told you can't migrate them through this area. The Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, even from the beginning, it's one that has not been well considerate of local people. Recently in 2010, they expanded it to include Mount Gorongosa without much consultation with local people, which has been very controversial because there's 2,000 people that live on that mountain. Many, many other examples that we could point out. So that's what we talk about with parks and people. It's not meant to make you depressed. I believe in the power of correctly protected places to conserve wildlife, but we have to think about the effects on people, just pure and simple. If you care about people, and I think all of us do, we got to think about people as part of that equation. We got to think about cultures, right? The part of what we're talking about is people that may move somewhere else, probably be in poverty, probably don't have a lot of starting capital or starting skills to work in an industrialized economy, will probably go work in an urban area at very low pay, and a cultural way of life potentially will be lost. Right? There are big effects to that if we do this in a way that displaces. Gonzalo Oviedo, he's head of social policy at IUCN. So, IUCN's an environmental group. This isn't sort of somebody being mean to the environmentalists or something. He says, conservation has changed a lot. Governments are more likely now to restrict the rights of people who live in protected areas. They may ban hunting or farming, the cutting of trees or fishing. The effect is to force people to move. They are more careful now about evictions. So, early 20th century, people being evicted for national parks, even in the U.S., or definitely in the U.S. and kind of starting in the U.S., happen all the time. Very tragically, many national parks in the U.S., for example, the Grand Canyon National Park, basically restricted the Havasupai people to one village when they traditionally used that whole area to move around in. One village that was at the bottom of a canyon and doesn't receive very long days during parts of the year, which of course, as we know as Alaskans, can exacerbate seasonal affective disorder and other issues. Almost quasi-imprisonment within the national park. I don't mean to over-dramatize it, not a literal imprisonment, but like kind of a quasi-resource, quasi-imprisonment, especially given policies towards Native Americans at the time and staying in reservation areas. So yeah, imprisonment. For the community. And so there's stuff like that that's obviously had some changes over time, but we still see those kinds of evictions going on even today. It's reduced, but at the same time, even when people aren't being evicted or displaced for a new protected area, they're oftentimes effectively done so, because if you're not allowed to like hunt or farm or fish, like what are you going to do there? They are often poorer than they were before, and the impact can be bigger than if they are moved out. Sad. It's very sad. Another critique of fortress conservation is that sometimes it's very untenable. Sometimes it works really well at achieving its conservation goals, whether or not it has very poor outcomes on local communities. Sometimes it works very well at preserving imperiled wildlife or imperiled ecosystems. Grand Canyon, I just made a very serious critique of how the park was founded. At the same time, I don't think anyone's denying that it helped restrict the number of industries and industrial activity right on the rim of the Grand Canyon, which was a realistic concern in the early 20th century, that it would be gobbled up by just hotels and different things. So it served to manage a lot of economic activity that was coming into the area, but had a very deleterious effect on the local community. So sometimes it works but has bad effects on local communities. Works in the sense of works to meet its conservation goal. Sometimes it doesn't work at all because you don't have actual community buy-in or for other reasons. A good example is with rhinos. Some rhino protected areas work really well, but the nature of rhinos, how spread out they are, how few there are in some cases, like Sumatran rhinos, we have fewer than 80. Same with Javan rhinos. Sometimes it's such that you have to really invest in making sure that there are people like patrolling all the time. And often this have to be done by like small local environmental NGOs or governments that don't have a lot of capital, right? But have to be like hiring these people to serve as like anti-poachers, because you can't literally put a fence. Even in fortress conservation, most protected areas, we can't literally fence the whole thing off for all sorts of different reasons. It's very costly among other things and not very effective in some cases. So you have to invest heavily in anti-poaching, and sometimes that works really well. Sometimes that works very poorly. And so, good example of the poorly side of that equation, Kruger National Park. It's in South Africa, sharing a border with Mozambique. In theory, there as a national park that should be protecting a large population of, I think it's of the southern white rhino population. And indeed, a lot of rhinos are found in protected areas now, either zoos or protected areas, and that hasn't stopped poaching. It may have reduced poaching. It's hard to say it hasn't, since we can't like run an experiment with a parallel Earth, but certainly poaching continues, as you can see, reaching a peak in 2014-2015 and then declining significantly. Poaching done for a variety of reasons, including traditional medicinal uses of ivory in Vietnam, among other places, also parts of China. Other poaching for other reasons as well, use for ceremonial daggers in certain one or two of the countries in Southwest Asia and Middle East. There's a variety of reasons rhinos are poached. I mean, ultimately poached partly because the local people can gain a tremendous amount of money in a resource scarce area by selling ivory. And it's a really sad thing, and sometimes drastic measures are taken to try to stop it. For example, in Kruger now, they've taken to cutting off the horns preemptively so that they're not like a poaching target. Like, why kill the rhino if the rhino doesn't have a horn, right? So, thankfully poaching's gone down, but it's still not like non-existent, with hundreds of animals dying a year, and a lot of animals dying, for example, in Kruger. And so, just because you put in a fortress conservation area where in theory there's no hunting, or doesn't mean it's actually well protected. There's also like a diamond mine that operates in that, or sometimes there's like mines that operate in these areas too, which is a whole nother thing. Sorry, I had a text I had to respond to really quick. So, all of this isn't to say fortress conservation should never be used as a model. I'm not saying like no more wilderness areas. I'm suggesting that we have to think very seriously about it, and that it's, I think many would argue, much more appropriate in cases where there's literally not people there, and not appropriate when there are people living there. And indeed, since the 1990s, you've seen a big shift towards community-based conservation. The idea of getting local people involved in protecting the area, employing them as anti-poachers, getting a tourism venture going, and hoping that will increase local employment, a variety of things. And sometimes that's worked really nicely, and sometimes it hasn't. It kind of depends. The trusty reading's a good example that I had you do. They're talking about the Madidi protected area in Bolivia. It's really large, 18,000 square kilometers. It's the size of like multiple Texas counties, which I only know because I first taught about this in Texas, so I had to like make a comparison that my students would understand. It kind of worked in the sense that people don't like hate the protected area, as you read about, partly because they picked an area that didn't have a ton of people to begin with, and of the people even among that area, they picked an area that doesn't get used as much. But people were, and they also did, I think, creative solution in the sense of a highly protected area, and then an area where there's managed use, but people are allowed to farm and hunt and things like that. And so Teresa Trusty did research in 06, 07 and found that residents were okay with the area, kind of, right? Again, it wasn't a widely used area. It was far away from their central communities. But at the same time, they were upset that they'd not been informed ahead of time, but rather after the fact. It's good that the government informed them at all, which is some governments don't, but you really should have actually gotten like consent or at least some kind of like informational situation to the local communities ahead of time. There was also concerns over the equity of benefits. The idea that yes, these areas are providing like tourism dollars to a few people, but a lot of us don't benefit from that, or outside groups benefit, right? Or maybe just benefits don't look like they're really appearing at all in our communities, right? There's a lot of communities, not just one. Communities feeling completely left out from any sort of benefit. At the same time, people recognize and acknowledge ecosystem services, right? So the NGOs have done a big job of publicizing, oh, here's all the great reasons to preserve this forest, and people will like echo some of the sentiments of these NGOs, like down to the rhetoric that the NGOs use, things like, oh, forests are the lungs of the world, right? That they like provide oxygen. Or people will say, oh, you know, it's good for hunting. If we overhunt in an area, then the animals are over there kind of replenishing themselves, right? So that's good. Or, you know, we chase an animal into there and then it survives and then it can breed. So people recognize some good benefits, but not really the benefits that were hoped for, which was like a big time economic development for the people as well. So, you know, a take home from that study, just because we try to do community-based protection doesn't mean it always works. It works better if there's outreach. It works better if there's outreach ahead of time, whether or not the government legally has to. It's very important in making sure that it's something the local community understands and buys in on, even if it makes things take a lot longer. And benefits increase support or perception of benefits, because sometimes people may be benefiting a little bit, but their perception is that it's not equitable. Ultimately, there are not enough anti-poachers in the world to treat everything like a fortress, even if we wanted to, and I don't think we do. I think we can do better than that. So we have to think about a variety of different types of protected areas at different types of scales. So that's, you know, kind of my spiel about sustainable development as well as protected areas. I want to now end us on kind of a bit of a hopeful note. This is Jack from the TV show Lost. If we can't live together, we're going to die alone. Sounds a little morbid, but what I'm trying to get at there is, you know, we do have one Earth, and we need to figure out how to sustain it, and sustain ourselves and sustain the other living beings, because like it or not, we are now the main, or one of the main, I shall say, driving forces in this whole thing. There's a reason some people use the term Anthropocene, right? The human-driven era. We're a huge influence now. Again, about 50% of the habitable land is occupied by us, and we affect huge amounts of fisheries, coastal fisheries as well. So we got to figure out a way not just to sustain ourselves, but also the rest of the household, the rest of the oikos, the rest of the living beings. That's a new thing in the sense of figuring out how to sustain 8 billion people that way. But it's not without precedent, right? The size is without precedent, the scale is without precedent, the complexity is without precedent. But the overall concept of humans figuring out how to fit into nature and sustain, not new at all. We've been doing it from the minute we existed. The scale's much bigger, but that doesn't mean it's insurmountable. Humans have figured out how to sustain themselves sustainably. It's a weird phrase, but sustain themselves sustainably in everywhere from the Arctic to the Kalahari, some of the most and least hospitable environments in the world. It's going to take work, it's going to take creativity, but we are a creative animal. We're the one animal that fully and completely gets to more or less design its own niches. I always struggle. Niches. Design its own way of making a living. So we're going to need work, we're going to need creativity, and we're going to need you, all of you. We don't have time for us to be morose about it, and I understand that better than most. As somebody with definitely depression, I get the tendency to just be grim and throw up our hands, but we need you. We need all hands on deck. There's great things that can be done if we work together to figure out a better future for all of us. So that's my spiel. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.